All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep, really deep, into something so essential, how culture shapes our psychology. You sent us this textbook, Culture and Psychology, and I think we're both excited to unpack it and figure out just how much culture impacts our thoughts, feelings, and even our actions, sometimes in ways we might not even realize.
Yeah, I think it's such an important perspective. Psychology historically has often had a bit of a Western bias,
Hmm.
focused on a certain way of looking at things. And I think exploring culture really broadens our understanding of the human experience, all the diverse ways people think and behave around the world.
Exactly. And for you listening, we know you want to grasp these big ideas quickly but thoroughly. So, in this deep dive, we're going to break down those core concepts in cultural psychology in a way that's clear, engaging, and hopefully makes you think a bit differently. So, let's just dive right in and maybe start with something that seems kind of basic but is actually pretty complex.
Mhm.
What exactly is culture?
That's a great place to begin. And right off the bat, the textbook poses this fundamental question. Are the things we think are true about the human mind, do they apply to everyone, everywhere, or are they specific to certain cultures? That right there tells you why understanding culture is so important.
And when we try to actually define culture, it seems there are a lot of different ways to look at it. I mean, the book outlines a whole bunch of definitions.
Yeah, there are quite a few. Early on, there's Roll Borner, back in the 80s, suggesting we can think of culture in two main ways. First, as the actual stuff created by human groups, the artifacts,
Oh,
the tools, the art, all those things. And second, as the broader system of learned meanings that a group shares and passes down through generations. It's all the shared knowledge, the beliefs, the traditions, everything from how we use tools to the stories we tell.
so it's both the tangible, physical stuff and the shared mental world of a group.
Exactly. Then you've got Triandis, who added another layer, pointing out the difference between those external observable parts of culture, like those tools we mentioned, and the internal subjective parts, the beliefs, attitudes, norms, those kinds of things. And that links back to this older idea of explicit culture, the stuff you could easily see, and implicit culture, the deeper meanings and assumptions that aren't always so obvious.
It's like the iceberg analogy, right? There's the tip you can see, but then this huge mass of stuff hidden beneath the surface.
Yeah, a perfect analogy. And the book just keeps going, bringing in more perspectives. Jehoda argues that culture isn't only about these rules and meanings, but also about the actual behaviors we engage in. Then there's the idea of culture as kind of like a group personality, or these shared symbol systems that go beyond any one individual, which Gertz talks about.
So many ways to think about it, but they all seem to point to the same core idea, right?
Right. And the textbook itself kind of boils it down to a simpler but still powerful definition from Berry and colleagues. Culture as the shared way of life of a group.
Simple, but the book points out that even that simple definition has some, I guess you could say, fuzziness to it. Like, culture isn't this perfectly defined box.
Totally agree. It's not a hard category with clear boundaries. It's more of a socio-psychological construct.
Mhm.
What defines a culture is that people within it share certain psychological features, values, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. If you share those, you're part of that cultural group, and if you don't, well, you're probably not.
So it's less about where you were born and more about this shared mental world.
Exactly. And the book delves into why these shared ways of thinking and acting exist in the first place. Essentially, cultures help groups survive. They figure out a way to balance individual needs with group needs, given the resources they have available.
Kind of like a mental survival kit passed down through generations.
Precisely. Cultures favor behaviors, attitudes, values, even opinions that are most effective for using resources and meeting those needs for survival. That's what Portinga suggests anyway.
Makes sense. Now, the book mentions some terms that often get lumped in with culture, but they're not exactly the same thing, things like ethnicity and nationality. Can you help unpack those a bit?
Sure. So ethnicity is broader. It can include ancestry, language, cultural traditions, all of those. Finney argued that ethnicity gives you a label, but culture is the actual psychological substance underneath.
Hmm.
The norms, values, a sense of ethnic identity, even the attitudes you might hold as part of a minority group. That's where culture comes in. It makes those ethnic differences psychologically meaningful.
Okay, so ethnicity is the umbrella, and culture is the specific content under that umbrella. What about nationality then?
Nationality is simply the country you're from. And a lot of times it's used as shorthand for culture, both in everyday conversation and even in research. We talk about French culture or American culture as if they're the same thing.
Right, and the book notes that in cross-cultural research, scientists sometimes compare people from different countries and just assume those differences are due to culture.
Yeah, the assumption being that nation equals culture. And while there's often overlap, it's crucial to remember that one country can have many different cultures within it, and a single cultural group can span multiple countries.
That's a super important point. So how do we actually acquire our culture? Is it something we're born with?
The textbook is clear. Culture is learned. It's not innate. Now, babies might have certain tendencies that make learning some cultural things easier,
Hmm.
but they don't arrive pre-programmed with a specific culture. As they grow up, they learn those behaviors, patterns, values, customs, all the things that are considered normal
Yeah.
in their cultural context.
It's this ongoing process of absorbing those cultural norms as we develop. And this leads to a really interesting point the book makes about psychology as a field itself.
Yeah, this is crucial. A lot of what we think we know about psychology comes from studying people in Western societies, mostly American and European. The way we design studies, the theories we develop, they're all influenced by those particular cultural lenses.
So our understanding of the mind isn't necessarily universal. It's built on a specific cultural foundation.
Precisely. And the book talks about this move towards a more multicultural psychology, one that recognizes and incorporates the incredible diversity of human thought and behavior across different cultures, understanding that people don't all fit neatly into a Western-created mold.
Sounds like psychology is realizing it needs to expand its horizons a bit. And the book also brings up a critical ethical responsibility here.
Absolutely. Psychology aims to help people through therapy, counseling, all sorts of interventions.
Hmm.
So it has this responsibility to make sure the knowledge it generates is accurate and applicable to people from all backgrounds. Theories are only as good as their ability to work in the real world. And that means being sensitive to cultural differences when we're trying to understand and help people.
That's a great point, and it really sets the stage for our next topic, how we actually do cross-cultural research to understand these differences and similarities. I'm guessing it's not as simple as just comparing people from different countries, right?
You got it. The textbook introduces cross-cultural research as this essential tool for testing the boundaries of what we think we know about psychology. It helps us see if things hold true across different cultural contexts.
And it brings up this idea of culture as an unspecified variable. What does that mean?
It refers to this tendency in some older research to just compare groups from different cultures and then say any difference is due to culture without digging deeper into which specific aspects of culture are at play. Siegel, Strutbeck, they pointed this out a while back.
So it's like this big, vague label we slap on things without really knowing what's inside the box.
Yeah, precisely. That's why the book emphasizes unpackaging studies. Instead of just saying culture, we need to identify and measure concrete context variables, specific values, beliefs, practices that can actually explain the differences we observe.
So replace that fuzzy culture label with more specific, measurable factors.
Exactly. We have to measure those things, then use statistics to see if they actually account for the cultural differences. And if they don't explain everything, we need to keep looking.
Makes sense. What about the challenges researchers face when they try to do this kind of cross-cultural work? What are some of the big hurdles?
One big one is sampling. There's often this assumption that everyone within a cultural group is basically the same. So if we find differences between, let's say, people in the US and people in Japan, we might jump to the conclusion that it's a cultural difference. But those same differences might exist within each country too, between different regions, different cities, different groups.
So a difference between two national groups doesn't automatically mean it's a fundamental cultural difference in the way we might think about it.
Right. It could be other factors that just happen to vary alongside culture. And the book suggests researchers try to account for this statistically by controlling for things like religion, socioeconomic status, those kinds of variables. But that only works if they've been reliably measured in all the groups being compared, which isn't always the case.
Right, and those variables need to actually be present and diverse across all the cultures in the study.
Exactly. The book also introduces this idea of cultural effect size statistics. It's a way to figure out if the differences we see between cultural groups are actually meaningful in real life. It helps us avoid making sweeping generalizations based on statistically significant but maybe tiny practical differences. It's about moving beyond stereotypes.
It's not just about saying Group A is different from Group B, it's understanding how big and meaningful those differences actually are. Now, culture isn't just something out there, it exists within individuals, too. How does research account for that individual variation within a culture?
Right. Culture exists at both the social level, the shared norms and values, and at the individual level, how each person embodies and expresses those norms and values. The challenge for researchers is figuring out the main dimensions along which cultures vary psychologically, things like attitudes, values, beliefs, and finding ways to measure those both between and within cultures.
Kind of like mapping a landscape that's both shared and unique to each person walking through it.
Perfect analogy. And one tool that's been really helpful, which the book highlights, is this concept of individualism, collectivism, or IC.
I've heard of that. How does that help in cross-cultural research?
IC gives us a way to predict and understand cultural differences without falling into those stereotypical traps. It looks at how much a culture values things like independence and personal achievement versus things like group harmony and interdependence. Researchers like Hui and Triandis did a lot of work on this, and then Hofstede's research in the 80s, where he ranked countries on this dimension, really brought it to the forefront.
So instead of saying Americans are different from Japanese people, we can look at where they fall on this spectrum to understand potential differences.
Precisely. It gives us a more nuanced framework. The book also talks about the importance of equivalence in cross-cultural research. This means making sure that the methods we use, the things we're measuring, actually have the same meaning across different cultures. Even something as simple as a questionnaire with a rating scale, people from different backgrounds might understand those scales differently.
Yeah, that makes sense. A 1 to 5 scale might feel natural to someone from one culture, but totally foreign to someone else.
Right. And despite all these challenges, the book ends this section on a hopeful note. It acknowledges that doing good cross-cultural research is tough, but we can still gain valuable insights, especially when findings converge across multiple studies. It's about being thoughtful and understanding the limitations.
So despite all the complexities, it's essential for getting a clearer picture of the human mind in all its diversity. Now, once we acknowledge those cultural differences, how do we avoid judging others based on our own cultural standards? That brings us to ethnocentrism, prejudice, and stereotypes.
These are key concepts. The book defines ethnocentrism as seeing the world through your own cultural filters, which the book suggests is a normal outcome of growing up in a particular culture. We all learn the rules of the game in our own society.
It's like our cultural operating system shaping how we see everything.
Exactly. And when we're interacting with people from our own culture, we share those unspoken rules. There's this sense of acceptance, even if we disagree on specifics.
But what happens when we meet people from different cultures with different roles?
That's where it gets tricky. Our minds are wired to categorize the world, to make sense of all the information we encounter. We group things together based on similarities. But here's the thing. Different cultures might use different criteria for those categories.
So what's important for categorization in one culture might not be relevant in another.
Right. And that's where ethnocentrism, coupled with stereotypes, can lead to prejudice and discrimination. The book defines prejudice as prejudging someone based on their group membership, relying on those stereotypes. And it's important to note, prejudice can be positive or negative, though we often focus on the negative.
So even a positive stereotype can still be prejudice if it leads us to make assumptions about individuals.
Absolutely. The book also touches on how emotions can play a role. Our mood can actually influence how we judge others, especially when we're interacting with people from different backgrounds.
Interesting. Our emotions can actually color our perceptions of others. Now, the book distinguishes between different kinds of stereotypes, too.
Yeah, there are autostereotypes, which are stereotypes about our own group, and then there are heterostereotypes, which are about other groups. And then you've got discrimination, which is the unfair treatment of others based on their group membership.
So prejudice is the attitude, and discrimination is the action.
Precisely. And the book also talks about how we evaluate situations, appraisals, and how we explain behavior attribution, and how those processes can be biased by our cultural lens.
It ends this section with this idea of flexible ethnocentrism. What's that all about?
It's the ability to temporarily set aside your own cultural assumptions, your own ingrained ways of seeing the world, to try and understand someone else's perspective from their cultural viewpoint, recognizing that your way isn't the only way.
That sounds like a crucial skill, especially in today's world. Now, after laying this groundwork, the book dives into how culture impacts basic psychological processes. Let's start with perception.
Perception is how we take in information through our senses. And the book starts by reminding us what we perceive isn't always a perfect reflection of reality, even without considering culture. Think about the blind spot in our vision, for example.
Right, our brains are always interpreting and constructing our experience. So if even basic perception isn't perfectly objective, how does culture add another layer to that?
Well, a lot of research is focused on visual perception, using those classic optical illusions, the Miller-Lyer illusion, the horizontal-vertical illusion, the Ponzo illusion. These illusions play on our brain's assumptions about the world, and cross-cultural research has found that how strongly people experience those illusions can differ across cultures.
Wow, so people might actually see those illusions differently.
It seems so. There's been debate about why, with some suggesting biological differences in the eye. But research comparing groups in different environments indicates that the environment we grow up in plays a big role. People who live in more carpentered environments, with lots of straight lines and right angles, tend to be more susceptible to certain illusions.
So the physical world, which is often shaped by culture, actually influences how our visual system interprets things. That's amazing. Let's move on to cognition. The book defines it as all the mental processes we use to turn sensory input into knowledge. What's culture's role there?
Culture impacts all sorts of cognitive processes. The book touches on memory, for instance. Studies have found links between things like formal schooling and memory abilities, like remembering lists of words.
It's hard to disentangle whether it's the schooling itself or other related cultural factors that are driving those differences. The book also talks about how memory can be linked to our stereotypes.
Yeah, research has shown that when people remember stories that challenge their existing stereotypes better, they tend to show less stereotyping themselves. So actively engaging with information that goes against our biases might actually help weaken those biases.
That's encouraging to think that exposing ourselves to different perspectives can have a real impact. What about facial recognition, something so fundamental?
There's a well-documented same-race bias in face recognition. We're generally better at recognizing faces of people from our own racial group than those from other groups. This has all sorts of implications, especially in areas like eyewitness testimony.
Yeah, that's a big one. What about more complex stuff like problem solving?
Studies have found cultural variations in problem-solving approaches. Research in less formally educated communities has shown that people might have difficulty with abstract logical problems, particularly when the content is unfamiliar. Formal schooling seems to play a big role in developing those abstract reasoning skills. But the book makes it clear, all cultures cultivate problem-solving abilities that are relevant to their specific context.
So, the types of problems and the ways we solve them might differ, but the basic human capacity for problem solving is there, just shaped by different needs and experiences. Now, the book briefly touches on decision-making and creativity, too.
Yeah, cross-cultural research on decision-making is still developing. The book highlights the need to understand how cultural values and tendencies might influence the strategies people use when making choices. For creativity, the typical Western view often emphasizes things like divergent thinking, risk-taking, and individual effort.
And finally, the always complex topic of intelligence.
Right. The book mentions the classic nature versus nurture debate and the challenges of creating culturally fair IQ tests. While there's evidence for genetic influences, there's also a lot of research showing how environment and culture shape intelligence. And the book acknowledges those ongoing debates around IQ differences between racial and ethnic groups, pointing out the complexities of that research.
It seems like culture has this deep, pervasive influence on even these seemingly basic aspects of our minds, from how we see the world to how we think, remember, and solve problems. So how do we actually learn all these cultural ways of being? That brings us to enculturation and socialization.
These two terms are really connected. Enculturation is specifically about learning the ways of our own culture. Socialization is broader. It's about learning the social rules and norms of the society we live in. So enculturation is like the cultural part of socialization.
And who are the key players in this process? Who teaches us our culture?
The book points to several important agents. Our parents are often the first and most influential, passing down values and customs right from the start. But siblings, extended family, friends, peers, schools, religious institutions, social groups, they all play a role in reinforcing cultural norms and behaviors.
It's a collective effort, consciously and unconsciously shaping us into culturally competent individuals. And the book mentions, while there are some universal aspects of parenting, there are also big differences across cultures.
Yes, some research has found cross-cultural similarities in what parents emphasize at different ages. But other studies have found variations in things like parental warmth, control, and the specific values they instill. The book gives examples showing how parenting styles and their impact on kids can differ across cultures.
Right, and family structures themselves can vary widely, which obviously influences child rearing.
Absolutely. Extended family often plays a much more central role in many cultures than in the typical Western nuclear family model. The book gives examples from Japanese American, Arab American, and African American communities, where extended family provides a lot of support and guidance in raising children.
Even something like how a society views daycare reflects its cultural values and beliefs about children and the roles of parents and the community.
Exactly. The book contrasts the U.S., where childcare is often seen as a private family matter, with places like Israel, where it's viewed as a public responsibility. That difference in perspective shapes the whole landscape of childcare.
And cultural influences on learning are super clear in education, especially in subjects like math.
Yeah, there are consistent differences in math achievement between countries. Some argue that math skills aren't just abstract, but are deeply tied to cultural practices and how math is taught and learned. Parental values play a role, too. For example, in some East Asian cultures, there's a strong belief that all kids can excel in math with effort, versus a more individualistic focus on innate talent.
It seems like the education system itself is a powerful tool for enculturation, teaching us not just subjects, but also values, beliefs, and norms.
Absolutely. The book stresses that differences in educational practices both reflect and reinforce cultural differences, playing a vital role in transmitting culture across generations. Now, the book also talks about different models of cultural transmission.
Right, it's not just a one-way street from parents to kids.
Exactly. Older models focused on parental influence, but newer perspectives see it as a two-way street. A child's temperament and how they process information shape how parents act, and that contributes to how culture is maintained and even changed over time. Parents and kids are seen as partners in this cultural dance.
It's this complex interplay. And the book mentions different parenting styles, like authoritarian, authoritative, permissive, noting that how they look and their effects can vary across cultures. It also touches on cultural differences in infant temperament and how parents respond to those innate differences.
For instance, the observation that some Asian and Native American infants tend to be calmer could be reinforced by cultural practices that value calmness and restraint, like cradle boards, or an emphasis on emotional control. So there's this interaction between a child's natural tendencies and the cultural context.
It's fascinating how intertwined nature and nurture are right from the very beginning. So how do these processes of learning and internalizing culture shape our development as we grow? This leads us to culture and developmental processes.
Cross-cultural research has explored lots of developmental aspects. Take infant attachment. Studies in cultures where infants have multiple caregivers, like the EFA foragers, challenge the Western idea of a single primary attachment figure. Infants still form attachments, but the patterns of caregiving and social interaction look different from what's typically studied in Western contexts.
It broadens our understanding of what healthy early relationships can look like. The book also mentions Piaget's theory of cognitive development and how it's been studied across cultures.
Research generally suggests that Piaget's stages appear in the same order across cultures, hinting at a universal aspect to how our thinking develops. But the speed at which kids move through those stages can vary based on their cultural experiences and the tasks they're exposed to.
What about morality? Is our sense of right and wrong also shaped by culture?
Absolutely. Cross-cultural studies show a strong link between culture, morality, ethics, and even legal systems. Anthropological research has both supported and challenged Western theories of moral development, showing how certain values and principles are culturally specific.
Makes sense, since different cultures prioritize different values and have different social norms. Now, let's turn to gender, a huge part of development that's heavily influenced by culture.
The book makes this crucial distinction between sex, which is biological, and gender, which is about the social and cultural expectations associated with being male or female. Gender roles, gender identity, gender stereotypes, these are all largely shaped by culture.
So, while we're biologically male or female, our understanding of what it means to be a man or a woman, the roles, behaviors, characteristics, those are mainly cultural constructs.
Exactly. Research on gender stereotypes has found both similarities and differences across cultures. Interestingly, those stereotypes tend to be more differentiated in more traditional, hierarchical cultures and in those with lower economic development and less female participation in higher education.
So, cultural values and societal structures really shape those perceptions. And the book talks about how environmental factors and the division of labor within a society can also contribute to how gender differences play out.
As different societies adapt to their environments and organize labor, those roles and behaviors associated with men and women evolve in different ways, leading to a whole spectrum of gender differences across cultures. Some might promote equality, while others might emphasize more distinct roles for men and women.
And those culturally constructed gender roles can have a huge impact on people's lives and opportunities. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about how culture intersects with health and well being, starting with physical health.
The book highlights the growing body of research linking our psychological and social experiences to our health and risk for diseases, going beyond those older ideas like type A personality. Some studies have even suggested a potential connection between broad cultural patterns like individualism, collectivism, and things like heart disease rates.
That's fascinating. Could something as broad as our cultural values actually influence our physical health?
It's possible. Culture can influence our health in many ways, our attitudes towards healthcare, how we explain the causes of illness, the resources available, even whether we seek help when we're sick. The book gives an example of a study looking at Japanese and Japanese American women's views on osteoporosis, showing how cultural background can shape perceptions of a medical condition.
Right, and different cultures have different ideas about what constitutes health or illness and how the body works. This likely affects how people experience and report their symptoms.
Absolutely. It's important to consider these differences when developing effective health interventions. Now, moving on to emotions, another area tied to well-being.
Emotions seem so fundamental to being human, but the book argues that culture has a big influence on them.
It does. The world of emotions is incredibly diverse. How we experience, express, understand, and even label our emotions can vary significantly across cultures. There's this ongoing debate about whether some basic emotions are universal, while others are culturally specific.
So, are there some core emotions we all recognize, regardless of where we're from?
Research, like Ekman's, suggests there might be a few basic ones with universal facial expressions: happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, disgust. But culture comes in through what are called display rules, the norms that dictate when, where, and how intensely we can express those emotions.
So, the underlying feeling might be the same, but how we show it publicly can differ based on our culture. And the book mentions that cultures have different expectations about emotional expressiveness.
Right. Studies have found that people from different cultures have different ideas about how openly others should display their emotions. For instance, Australians were seen as more expressive of positive emotions than Japanese people, while both groups perceived each other's expression of negative emotions differently. Even climate has been linked to expressiveness.
Wow, even the weather might play a role. The book also talks about this collective reality that shapes our emotional tendencies.
Yeah, those shared cultural beliefs and values can influence what kinds of emotional experiences we have and how we interpret them. The book also discusses research on the universality of emotion appraisal processes, how we evaluate the situations that trigger our emotions. While some aspects seem consistent across cultures, others, like how much control we feel we have or who we blame, show cultural differences, maybe linked to individualism, collectivism. So while there might be some universal building blocks, culture shapes our emotional lives in profound ways. Now, let's explore language and communication, another fundamental part of human experience that's deeply cultural.
Culture and language are inseparable. Language isn't just a tool for conveying information. It shapes how we experience and even think about the world. The book mentions the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, or linguistic relativity.
That's the idea that the language we speak influences our thoughts, right?
Yeah. The strong version says language determines thought. But research, like studies on color perception, hasn't really supported that strong claim. A weaker version, that language influences thought, is more widely accepted. So, language might make us more likely to think in certain ways, but it doesn't completely constrain our thinking. Now, the book also discusses bilingualism.
Research on bilinguals suggests they might experience subtle shifts in their thinking depending on which language they're using. This supports the idea that language can influence thought. It's important to remember, being bilingual is totally normal, and the idea that bilinguals have different personalities in different languages isn't a problem.
It's more about different languages activating different cultural frameworks and associations. And the book cautions us against misinterpreting difficulties people might have processing information in a foreign language.
Right, people might take longer to respond or seem to struggle cognitively when using a second language. That's normal and shouldn't be seen as a sign of low intelligence. It's just part of the process.
Absolutely. And communication goes beyond just words. The book highlights the role of nonverbal behavior.
Facial expressions, gestures, tone of voice, eye contact, personal space, they all convey meaning, often unconsciously. Culture heavily influences both our verbal and nonverbal communication, from the words and grammar we use to how we express ourselves physically.
And our cultural filters and ethnocentrism definitely play a role in how we send and receive messages.
Yes, we learn culture-specific ways of communicating. When we encounter behaviors that violate our expectations, it can lead to misunderstandings, judgments, even stereotype formation, even within our own broader culture. In intercultural communication with different cultural codes at play, the potential for confusion and misinterpretation is even higher.
That can lead to all sorts of challenges, from uncertainty and ambiguity to conflict. The book mentions how different cultures approach conflict resolution, too.
Cultures valuing individualism often favor directness and taking personal responsibility for resolving issues. Cultures valuing collectivism often prioritize harmony and saving face, using more indirect approaches. Understanding these differences is crucial for successful intercultural interactions.
It highlights the need for cultural sensitivity in all our interactions. Now let's explore how culture shapes our sense of self and our personalities.
The book contrasts independent and interdependent self-construals, often associated with individualistic and collectivistic cultures. In individualistic cultures, the self is seen as separate, autonomous, defined by unique traits and goals. Self-esteem often comes from personal achievements, and internal attributes are central to identity.
While in collectivistic cultures, the self is more connected to others and group memberships, self-esteem might be tied to fitting in and contributing to group harmony.
Exactly. Goals might be group-oriented, and duties and obligations are highly valued. The interdependent self is more fluid, changing depending on the social context, with relationships being really important. People in collectivistic cultures are certainly aware of their internal thoughts and feelings, but they're less central to identity and behavior than relationships and roles.
This difference in how we see ourselves has huge implications for how we understand our place in the world and how we relate to others. And speaking of relating to others, the book explores how cultural differences in self-control can influence how we experience and express emotions.
Right. Research has shown that people with more independent self-construals tend to experience more self-focused emotions, like pride and anger, while people with more interdependent self-construals tend to experience more other focused emotions, like sympathy and shame. This highlights how our cultural understanding of the self shapes our emotional landscape.
It's like our culture provides a framework for how we experience and interpret our emotions in relation to ourselves and others. Now, the book also tackles this interesting question. Do people in different cultures actually strive for different things when it comes to feeling good about themselves?
There's been a lot of research on this, especially looking at self-enhancement, that tendency to view ourselves positively. For a long time, the dominant view was that self-enhancement is more common in individualistic cultures, where the focus is on individual achievement and standing out.
Like that classic self-serving bias, right? Taking credit for successes and blaming failures on external factors.
Exactly. But more recent research suggests that self-enhancement might happen differently in collectivistic cultures. It might be more implicit, meaning it shows up in subtle ways rather than outright bragging.
So less about overt boasting and more about subtly highlighting positive qualities.
Exactly. And instead of focusing on individual traits, self-enhancement in collectivistic cultures might be more about emphasizing positive qualities related to relationships and group harmony. It's less about me and more about us.
That's a really nuanced distinction. Now, the book also dives into how culture shapes our understanding of personality. It starts by defining personality as those enduring patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that make us unique individuals.
And it points out that in Western psychology, there's often this emphasis on personality traits being stable across different situations. This idea that we have this core set of characteristics that defines who we are, no matter the context.
But is that really how personality works? Is it always so consistent?
Well, that's where the cultural perspective comes in. Cross-cultural research has challenged this assumption of universal personality structure. Some argue that personality is more fluid and context-dependent, especially in collectivistic cultures.
So rather than having one fixed personality, we might actually adapt our behavior and even our self-presentation depending on the specific social situation we're in.
Exactly. Our personality might be more like a set of tools we use depending on the task at hand, rather than this fixed, unchanging entity. The book briefly mentions the five-factor model, or FFM, which is a popular framework for understanding personality.
I've heard of that. It's the one with those five broad traits: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, right?
Yeah, those are the big five. And there's been debate about how universal those traits really are. Some cross-cultural research has found support for the FFM in different cultures, but others argue that those five traits don't fully capture the diversity of personality across all cultures.
It sounds like the way we conceptualize personality itself might be influenced by our cultural assumptions. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's explore how culture influences our understanding of mental health and well-being.
This is a really important area, and the book really emphasizes how crucial it is.